it's a broad stroke of anatomical terms. So you might think, well, why do I even need to know these anatomical terms? But what I've learned as a teacher and the amount of questions that I get from students, it's really helpful to at least have the broad strokes. Because what will happen is somebody might ask you after class, you know, something related to their injury, and you'll probably have to say to them, you know what, I don't know the answer to that yet, I'll get back to you. Or you go, oh, well, that depends. You know, and you'll give them some answer that's not specific, and you might even direct them back to their own healthcare professional. But what I found is, if somebody asks me something like that, especially if it's a regular student or maybe a private client, I'm going to go and do my due diligence and do the best to research exactly what it is and how I can help them. So having a sort of basic understanding of anatomical terms is helpful when you get into that kind of research. So we're going to define the anatomical positions, just some of the basic terms, knowing, you know, movements of the body, including the role of the muscles, looking at some of the different types of joints, and that becomes really important in learning how to stabilize people's joints. So the anatomical, I'm sorry if this offends you, and hopefully you can't all see, but it is a naked man. Oh gosh. I don't know why they chose to put the entire nakedness, but anyway. So it's Tadasana, or mountain pose with the hands facing forward, is considered the basic sort of anatomical position. Anatomical planes. So just pretty simply, there's 3 planes of movement in the body. There's what we call the sagittal plane, and that's this movement backwards and forwards. I'll just demonstrate with my hips. So it's anything that moves in this direction. Is that making sense? Then you've got the coronal plane, which is any movement from the side of the body, like the arms and the legs moving in that way. Make sense? And then you have the transverse plane, which is the twisting. And so, you know, bones can move in the transverse plane in the joint, and the spine can move in the transverse plane. Make sense? So that's really, we're just going to look at that. These pictures can be a little confusing, exactly. Thank you. So coronal, the frontal plane, which is the one where the arms, it's the dark blue there, right, where the arms move out to the sides or the legs would. The sagittal plane is that purple line, so it's the moving front and back, and then the transverse is the, if you were to cut the body in half like that red line, you'd be able to, if you look down, you'd be able to see if one was twisting. And we'll look at those in a little bit more detail again. We'll come back to that. So in terms of location in the body, pretty simple, right? Lateral, away from the midline of the body. So it's the outer side. Medial, anything that's toward the midline. So if you're talking about the medial part of a limb, it's the inner part of the limb. Anterior, towards the front. These are terms you'll hear more often. The anterior, posterior. So you'd find this if my pelvis is tilted in an anterior way, it's tilted forward. Makes sense? Which gives me a big back, which we'll talk about later. And then if it's in a posterior tilt, my pelvis is going to be tucked under. And so I'll be losing the curve in my back. Make sense? Superior, just clearly towards the upper part of the body. Inferior, towards the lower part of the body. Superficial, clearly just to the outer part, the surface. And deep is further away from the body, so more internal. Proximal is the closest to the center of the body, to the navel, or closer to the point of attachment of a limb. So if you're talking about the proximal attachment, it's the part that's closest to the body. Distal, further away from the center of the body, further away from the attachment to the limb. So, the skeleton. It's broken up really into two parts. So you've got the axial skeleton, what's in the blue there, right? It's the spine, it's the rib cage, and it's the, oh, it's not really, my finger's a bit large. But, so clearly spine, rib cage, sternum here, and the skull. And then you have the appendicular skeleton, which is then basically everything else. So there's the other part of the skeleton. So the shoulder blades are actually not even attached to the back of the body. They just sit there, and they're entirely just sort of glued on by muscles, which gives them a lot of mobility. The shoulder joint is very shallow, gives it a lot of mobility. You can see the hip joint. It's deeper, right? There's a slight angle to it, which gives it more stability, but it also is a very, it's a very mobile joint in that it's a ball and socket joint. So the shoulder joint and the hip joint are both ball and socket joints, and so they have a lot of mobility, and therefore it's important to stabilize them when we're in asana. So, before I go there, I'll just ask you, what are some uses of the bones? Why do we have bones? Structure. Support. Protection. Leverage. Yes? Blood cells, exactly. Yep. They create blood cells. The malcium, that's a combination of magnesium and calcium. So the malcium balance. Exactly, that one. So you hear Yogi Bhajan talk about that when you do stuff like kick your butt with your heels, that it's balancing the calcium, magnesium in the body. I always go, well, how do you know that? But it's they're putting pressure on the bones, and the bones is where that is created. So, yes. So hard connective tissue. So the whole body is made up of connective tissue, right? It just depends on how hard it is. Muscles are pretty loose. And then as you go down and get into the bone, it's still connective tissue, and it's being regenerated on a constant basis. It's just very hard connective tissue. So support vital structures, leverage, stores minerals, produces new blood cells. So then we have cartilage. So we did bones. So cartilage is another form of sort of semi-rigid connective tissue that's more flexible than bone. Constitute parts of the nose, the ears, and the ribs. Covers the surface of the ends of some bones where they intersect and make joints, protecting the bones and providing fluid movement of joints. Can be damaged by trauma or excessive wear and tear, which can lead to arthritis. So anybody here experienced any kind of tear in their cartilage? What was it? A fall. Oh yeah, painful, right? Yeah.